Yes, well, thank you for mentioning the book. Yesterday, several of the panel participants made commercials for their books. You can find 8 of mine on Amazon, and so that'll help cover my train fare the next time I come down here. If you buy it from me today, I'll give you 2% off for cash. But it is good fun to be here. Good morning. Thank all of you for participating. Thank our C-SPAN audiences as well for listening in on the Centennial of Calvin Coolidge becoming President of the United States. And I think what's coming through is that there are a lot of lessons. Obviously, times and circumstances change, but principles of soundness, prosperity, liberty do not. So there's much to learn. So the title of our panel today is An Historic Tax Cut Campaign. Love that subject. Unfortunately, it's always with us, like one other subject. But in terms of taxes, let's begin by saying, people assume it's a natural part of human nature that the 1920s were inevitable, that this turned out to be a prosperous, innovative decade, would have happened no matter what. And the real truth is, I think is coming across here with this conference, is that people do make a difference. 1920s, if Teddy Roosevelt had lived, he died in 1919, January of 1919. If he had lived, he would have won the Republican nomination in 1920. He would have won the election. That would have been a very different administration. Would he have appointed Andrew Mellon to the Treasury? Probably not. Would he have pursued the tax cuts with the vigor, first of Harding and then especially with Calvin Coolidge? We know the answer to that. I love Teddy Roosevelt, but I want my economics from somebody else. And or if Herbert Hoover, you could make a case, and it could have very well happened with a few adroit maneuvers. Herbert Hoover, immensely popular among Democrats and Republicans, everybody, could have won the presidency in 1920. And there was an historian, great one, even though I didn't agree with all his conclusions, but a fellow named Richard Hofstadter, who wrote about the tragedy of Herbert Hoover, was that imagine if Herbert Hoover had become president in 1921 instead of 1929, how great his reputation would have been. Prosperous decade. That again assumes the decade was inevitable. Hoover had a very different attitude towards economic policy, another subject for another time, and he would not have appointed Andrew Mellon to the Treasury, and so it would have been a very different decade in terms of what we had. So tax cuts are crucial. As you've heard, the decade of the 1920s turned out to be one of the most innovative, constructive decades in human history, setting the stage for American growth and indeed for world growth for the rest of the 20th century. Extremely important, underrated decade. And tax cuts were crucial to it in creating the environment for this extraordinary outburst of innovation and bringing to the fore. When you talk about new technologies, it always takes time for those technologies to become ubiquitous, where everyone has it. Usually a 15, 20-year period, gestation period, before it becomes a consumer item. But in the 20s, so much came together. We had the film, watch that film on Coolidge, because it emphasizes what a great decade that turned out to be. But taxes made the difference. And if you want to see the difference, look at the U.S. versus Great Britain. In the 1920s, Britain had a horrible decade. Yes, it had some prosperity, but it was marked by civil strife, not just at the beginning of the decade, but throughout the decade. Unemployment in 1929 was still around 8 to 10%, while the U.S. had full employment. One of the key things is, unlike the U.S., they were very slow in getting rid of the wartime taxes. They never had a tax cut program that you saw from Harding and then especially from Calvin Coolidge, the vigor with which he and Mellon and Lord pursued that in terms of getting those tax cuts through, which we're going to touch on. And so by doing those major tax cuts, the U.S. had a booming decade, Britain had a stagnant decade. So tax cuts make a difference. As has been mentioned, coming out of World War I, 1913, when the income tax was enacted, it was all of 7%, the highest rate. And that was if you made several $million a year. By the end of the war, it was 77. The timid Wilson administration cut it to 73. Whoopee. but it was a real dead weight on the economy. Capital gains, which we're going to discuss, was unsettled in the 1913 Income Tax Act. It wasn't a special provision, so you could make a case that the capital gains tax would have been 73%. We'll find out how that didn't happen because of what Harding and Coolidge did. So they vowed normalcy. We did get Andrew Mellon, one of the foremost business moguls today, if not the foremost, as Treasury Secretary. And he understood, as few others did, the need to slash tax rates. Not taxes, but tax rates. And he said, quote, "The history of taxation shows that taxes which are inherently excessive are not paid. The high rates inevitably put pressure upon the taxpayer to withdraw his capital from productive business. The result is that the sources of taxation are drying up." He's talking about this when he took office. Wealth is not done right. The form of taxation dries up, and he says to carry it, the rich are not carrying their burden, not because they're bad, but because they're avoiding these excessive tax rates. So he said they don't end up paying their fair share of the burden, and he says capital is being diverted into channels which yield neither revenue to the government, adequate revenue to the government, nor profit to the people. So he would agree with Bernie Sanders that the rich aren't paying enough, but he saw the real reason for it was excessive taxation, which focused people's energies on the wrong thing. So in the Harding 21 tax cut, Harding Coolidge 1921 tax cut, was still a hard slog. You had progressives and Southern populists who opposed it. They did make changes in the capital gains, did remove the wartime excess profits tax, but it's still more needed to be done. Coolidge pursued it in 1924 after he became president, but he was considered by many as a lame duck. Ferocious fight to get that 1924 tax cut through. They managed to get the top rate down from 57 to 46, but there was a lot of bad stuff in it. They couldn't get it down to 25, a lot of bad stuff in it. One was the peeping Tom provision, which meant that your tax return, if you were rich, was accessible to the public. They'd post it in the IRS, so you could find out what the income was and what tax they paid. They call the peeping Tom. We'll touch on that. So just to reassure families, this is tax peeping Toms, and they also put in a gift tax, and so Coolidge was urged by many tax cutters to veto this bill, but he and Mellon realized, and this is what statesmanship is all about, that if you get something that is more good than bad, makes the economy stronger and eventually puts you in a position to do the big things. So they got the re-election in 1924, and then after another ferocious fight, again, opposed by progressives, many Southern populists, all these alternative tax bills were floating around. They managed to get it through in 1926, cut the rate to 25, cut excise taxes, which affect sales taxes on specific products. So it was one of the greatest tax cut bills in American history. And that's why the decade of the 1920s was so prosperous, such a good one. And so our panel is going to talk about the tax cut campaign and its effect. So we're going to we have three great speakers. We have Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, who is also an historian. We have Diana Furchtgott-Roth, who also has been involved in tax cuts fights. She's not only a superb economist, but involved in the tax cut fights in three Republican administrations. And then, of course, Jim Lucier, who also is a tax expert. So we're going to start first with you, Congressman. You're also doing a biography of Nicholas Longworth, who, as a Speaker of the House, also was very, very instrumental in getting through the Coolidge tax cuts. He understood it better than his predecessors. So you're doing a great biography. And by the way, I shouldn't do this, but the cable channels would love to look at Nicholas Longworth and his wife, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Some juicy stuff there just in their behavior. So I want my fee as suggesting that one. But anyway, Congressman French Hill, why don't you lead it off?
Wow, what an introduction. This is the G-rated Longworth Show. We do have the more explicit Longworth Show that can happen later at night. First, let me thank Amity for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's great to be with my colleagues, particularly Diana and I, who were 4 years together in one of those tax fights back in the administration of George H.W. Bush. Let me also congratulate the scholars who are here. It was such a treat to spend 4th of July weekend, the 150th 4th of July weekend for Calvin Coolidge at Plymouth Notch last summer, and hear you debate my bill from the House floor that price stability should be the sole mandate of the Federal Reserve, and I appreciate your question back here in the corner. And then what Arkansan can't say, but thank you for the Mountain Valley water from Hot Springs, Arkansas. You don't need any of those cable advertisements for sleep or balance of nature. You just need Mountain Valley water. Thank you very much.
And they're safer than vaccines. No, don't get into that.
So exactly 100 years ago, in February 1923, Nick Longworth was having a fit. He was really frustrated. The off-year elections of 1922, the Republicans in the Senate retained their majority, but their strength in the Senate was weakened by 7 seats. In contrast, insurgent progressive Senator La Follette of Wisconsin won in a landslide. And the clout of that Midwestern populist Farm Belt bloc, led by La Follette and Bill Kennan from Iowa, expanded their clout in the Senate. The Republicans in the House, their margin was slim. They maintained the majority, but they lost seats. And La Follette inspired Republican insurgents in the House, made electing leadership pretty tough. So tough that we didn't really talk about it until about a month ago, because that was the 22 elections that led to the fight that caused Nick Longworth to have a tough time becoming majority leader, and it took 9 ballots for Fred Gillette, former governor of Massachusetts, personal friend of Calvin Coolidge, to be elected speaker in December 1923, but more on that later. Longworth's frustration was compounded by the fact that those narrow majorities were accompanied by this bad split inside the Republican conference, thus making his goal of enacting Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon's badly needed tax reform tougher, much tougher. 2 years earlier, they'd been so optimistic and so well prepared. The Republicans had crushed the Democrats in 1920. 404 electoral votes, 60% of the popular vote, beating James Cox, Ohio governor. So you had 2 Ohioans running against each other, and FDR as VP for Cox. But it's clear, as everybody has said, and we learned in the movie last night, normalcy was the call of the day. And even Wilson said that we should lower tax rates and put the budget back on a post-war footing. So when Harding died of a heart attack and Coolidge became the president, of course, there was commonality of view, as Dr. Harding said a few minutes ago. But why was that? Was it the Teapot Dome people? Was it Florence Harding whispering in her husband's ear to be a conservative? Was it the fact that Calvin Coolidge was this absolute tax-cutting expert? No, the secret glue between the Harding and Coolidge consistency was Andrew Mellon. At Treasury, the first among equals of the Wilson holdovers was a guy named Parker Gilbert, who'd been a partner at J.P. Morgan, joined the Treasury to work on the war bonds issue, and at age 30 became the Undersecretary of the Treasury and became the top person to implement Mellon's scientific tax reform. And he stayed on to help guide that between the Harding and the Coolidge administrations. And we talked about the crushing war debt, but I mean, the U.S. cost, I love this one, Uncle Sam with U.S. expenses crushing him, and you got Calvin Coolidge say lots more to come off, unnecessary expenses, great Berryman cartoon. But what was the really struggle was the fact that the interest carry on the debt was $1 billion, more than the entire pre-war budget, just interest. So Mellon was going to lead this charge. You've talked about the budget in the previous panel. So he wanted to focus on revenues. And of course, the income tax was 10 years old in those early 1920s. And before then, taxes were from excise taxes and duties on import duties. That was about 80% of federal revenues. But after 1913, when we got the income tax case, Supreme Court ruling, by 1918, beginning of the war, 68% of federal tax revenues came from the income tax. And as Steve pointed out, every year there was a tax bill. We talked about 1918, we talked about 1921. And in 1921, that marginal rate, as you saw in your brochure, the base rate plus the surtax had reached 73%. That was the marginal tax rate. And so that was the beginning of this challenge. And the 1921 bill had this peeping Tom rule in it. It's worth mentioning because it's the talk of the town now, because that's the rule that got the tax returns of Donald Trump released. That is the rule dating back to that time. And it's because Wisconsin and La Follette had every income tax filing in Wisconsin after they had it was public, just like your property taxes, right? We know your assessed value for your home. We know what you pay in property tax. It's a matter of public record. The Wisconsin Midwestern populace wanted that for the income tax. And this peeping Tom provision has prevailed all these years in one form or another. So Treasury Secretary Gilbert Mellon thought they should press on anyway in the 1923-24 session, even though Longworth was telling them, I don't think we have the votes. So they press on. And Gilbert, behind the scene briefing to Mellon, to Coolidge, was, look, if Longworth can't get this through because of La Follette's power in the House and his bigger majority in the Senate, then we'll have this as the #1 campaign issue for 1924. And that's what they went about doing. So 2 days after Fred Gillette went through 9 ballots and Nick Longworth had an almost heart attack trying to become majority leader, in December 1923, Coolidge went to the House on a freezing cold Thursday, December 6th, to the joint session of Congress that he wholeheartedly endorsed the Mellon plan. High taxes reach everywhere and burden everybody. They gear most heavily upon the poor. They diminish industry and commerce. They make agriculture unprofitable. They increase rates on transportation. They are a charge on every necessity of life. That's the kickoff on live radio. 1 million listeners that night. So, Longworth goes to work, but smooth sailing was not to be, as noted by Steve Forbes, because Nick's favorite person in the world, besides his wife, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, well, let me stick with male friends.
Except for a certain senator from Ohio, from Idaho, I should say.
Exactly. His favorite male friend in the House was elected with him in 1903. They served on Ways and Means together, Foreign Affairs, and that's Jack Garner of Uvalde, Texas, who would become FDR's VP. But Jack Garner, on Ways and Means, the minority leader, was a master tactician on the House floor. So this battle pit Longworth against Garner. And Garner that year knew how to outsmart Longworth. So as Steve pointed out, and I won't dwell on this, they got it down, but it wasn't so good. They duked it out on the House floor from February to June 1924, and the Democrats teamed with the Follette insurgents, and they beat the Mellon plan. But, as Steve says, they got it down somewhat. And that's when Gilbert's plan to make it a 1924 election season the top issue. Mellon released his book, Taxation, the People's Business, and it was sent to free copies to every school, college, public library, and chambers of commerce. They had tax clubs in every state, particularly the states of the members of the Ways and Means Committee. Good Lord. We would think of that as AstroTurf now. Oh. But it was truly grassroots, and they lobbied every member intensively. And at the bottom line was by the 1924 election, they have an outstanding victory, 54% of the vote, and that gave the advantage to Longworth. And the bottom line was, in that next year of 1925 and 26, they were able to run that bill through, and Longworth did something that Speaker McCarthy has not done. He took the 15 members that campaigned against Coolidge in 24 and said that he loved them. He thought they were great people. I'm sure they acted out of principle. I'm sure they were fine members of Congress from their district, but he wouldn't invite them to any meetings of the Ways and Means Committee, and they couldn't come to the Republican conference meeting, and that made it a little easier to vote out of committee the Mellon tax plan, which ultimately passed, and Jack Garner basically rolled over, and one of my favorite aspects of this was, and I'll conclude with this, turned over to my colleagues, was at the signing ceremony. Here's how I described it. At just before 10 in the morning on February 26th, 1926, so 3 years of trying to make this happen, 23, 24, 25, 26, they never gave up, persistence. Congressional leaders, including Democratic ranking member on Ways and Means, Jack Garner, Finance Committee chairs Reed Smoot, ranking member Herbert Simmons, House Majority Leader John Tilson, Chairman Green, and Secretary Mellon gathered with President Coolidge in his office to sign the Revenue Act of 1926. Those in the photograph imply a very bipartisan conclusion to a 3-year legislative battle. The saber-toothed tiger coalition, in opposition to the Mellon plan, led by La Follette and Garner 2 years before, were now purring house cats, jockeying for position in a White House signing ceremony photograph. A dozen reporters documented the ceremony, and Senator Simmons nearly burned a hole in the president's jacket with his lit cigar.
Whoa.
And at 10:22 a.m., it was done, in plenty of time for the goal of having it signed before Tax Day 1926.
One of the nice things about that tax bill was that it was made retroactive to 1925, doing something good instead of figuring out ways to postpone good things or take more money out of your pocket. Our second speaker is Dana Friscott-Roth. She is an outstanding economist. You're at the Heritage Foundation right now, but enormous experience. You're an expert on energy and a lot of other things, but Diana today is going to go through on the actual revenue impact of these tax cuts. And the surprising thing that revenues did not disappear when tax rates went down. Revelation, newsflash for many members of Congress today. But anyway, tell us what happened in the 20s with those rate cuts.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. I want to thank Amity for inviting me and for putting on this whole conference. It's been talked a lot about Amity's biography of Coolidge, but one of her first books was called The Greedy Hand, and it was about how taxes have unintended consequences. And Steve, I am a huge fan of the flat tax.
You have that enlightened look about you.
Yes, I'm a huge fan. It would make revenues greater. It would save everybody from the burdens that they are coming towards in February and March when they spend hours and hours figuring out what their taxes are. And French, I'm so glad that you are in the House so you can do something about making our tax system more efficient and simpler, with, of course, Jim's help. I want to thank all the students for coming and for listening, and thank our audience on C-SPAN. Well, if Congress could wave a magic wand and have the poor pay a smaller share of taxes and the rich pay a larger share, who would be against that? Would anyone be against that? And how would Congress do it? Well, the answer is Congress would cut taxes. That's what happened in the 1920s, and that's what can happen today. The 1920s tax cuts reduced the marginal tax rate from 73% to 25% for individuals earning $100,000 or more per year. And at that same time, taxes paid by these high-income earners increased from 300 million to over 700 million per year. For high-income earners, the result was that they paid a greater share of total income taxes. In 1920, taxpayers earning over 100,000 were paying about 30% of the share of total income taxes. By 1928, they were paying 61% of the share, more than double. These tax cuts increased the net income of high-income and middle-income individuals, and consequently, high-income individuals paid greater shares of total income taxes. Low-income earners paid a smaller share of total income taxes. In 1920, 24% of total income taxes came from taxpayers earning 10,000 or less. By 1928, only 3.1% of total income taxes came from taxpayers earning less than $10,000 a year. The result of Coolidge's tax cuts demonstrated that an increase in total income across the board among taxpayers at all income levels. The number of taxpayers in the high-income group nearly quadrupled at this time, and the number of taxpayers earning less than 10,000 decreased. The number of taxpayers earning between 10,000 and 100,000 increased by 84%. Tax revenues initially declined in the mid-1920s, but tax revenue increased as incomes rose. By 1928, tax revenues had superseded the 1920 level, despite the implementation of tax cuts. In 1924, Coolidge said, and I quote, "Experience does not show that the higher rate produces the larger revenue. Experience is the other way." During his tenure in office, the national debt declined from 26% to 16% of GDP, and GDP grew at an annual average of 3.5%. Coolidge reduced the national debt from $23 billion to about $18 billion in just 6 years. His administration oversaw the elimination of 1/4 of federal debt and considerable growth for local and state governments. Well, let's look at some current tax proposals. One proposal is the wealth tax. How many of you students are in favor of a wealth tax? How many of you think it would make you better off as students? Well, I can see that there's no takers. The wealth tax comes up
We don't believe in secret
periodically.
ballots here.
It comes up periodically. It's a favorite of the best-selling author Thomas Piketty from France. But it's difficult to measure. How do we measure wealth? It's difficult to know. And if there were a wealth tax, your parents would not be able to pass on their accumulated savings to you, and you would not get to keep all the earnings that you're going to get from your good jobs that come from your excellent education. There's unrealized capital gains, which my colleague Jim is going to talk about, but assets change in value all the time. Take a work of art, for example. Say we have a Monet, a beautiful river painting by Monet, or a beautiful Turner painting of the Houses of Parliament. It changes value. 1 month it could be worth $5 million. That same month, the next year, it could be worth $10 million. It's very difficult to measure wealth because assets change in value all the time. You can look at the price of gold. The price of gold goes up and down all the time. How is one going to measure wealth in order to tax it every year? And if wealth goes down in 1 year, say from 2 million to 1 million, are people going to get a credit the next year because their wealth declined? I don't think that that's in Congress's plan. Stocks change all the time, but you can read what their value is in the paper, but the value of an old car, the value of a piano, these are very, very difficult to measure. Plus, people can hide wealth by, say, giving their wives or their mistresses a pair of diamond earrings, for example. And then how would one value those? And then what if the couple got divorced? What would happen to that sum and the value of the diamond earrings? Crypto is another asset that we can see goes up and down. So a wealth tax, I would say, is very difficult to administer and is a kind of tax that I think only an academic would propose, because in practice it doesn't work very well. Another kind of tax that only an academic would propose is a carbon tax, and you see proposals for a carbon tax across the political spectrum. This tax is ostensibly to reduce emissions. How many of you here are in favor of reducing emissions? All of you. That's great. So none of you should be in favor of a carbon tax. Because if there was a carbon tax here in the United States, energy-intensive manufacturing would not stop globally. It would stop in the United States, but it would likely go offshore to China, where it would be produced instead of with clean natural gas, of which we have so much here in the United States. It would be produced by China's coal-fired power plants. And China's coal is much dirtier than American coal produced, for example, in Wyoming and West Virginia and elsewhere. So global emissions would increase with a US carbon tax. Plus, such a tax is regressive. People with old cars and old equipment would pay more with a carbon tax than people who could afford, say, a modern car. Someone like me who drives a 2004 Jeep, I would pay more with a carbon tax than one of you people in the audience who might be driving a 2020 Mercedes, for example. In addition, there's geographic disparities. So people who have to drive far because of their work, such as farmers or small businesses, they would pay more in this carbon tax. And it's no fault of their own that they live in places with lower incomes, spread apart. In distances in Arkansas, for example, are further apart than distances in the Washington metropolitan area. Zero-emission vehicles. How many of you think that zero-emission vehicles decrease global emissions? Well, a couple of you do. But these zero-emission vehicles are run by electric batteries. So if you have a zero-emission vehicle under the carbon tax here in the United States, it would do very well. And we'd have a lot more of these electric vehicles. But the batteries to run them are produced in China with the coal-fired power plants. There is mining for the minerals. That also produces emissions. And a carbon tax, if it resulted in more electric vehicles, which it likely would not decrease global emissions. So we have to be very careful of unintended consequences of wealth taxes and carbon taxes, and we can go back to the 1920s to see that lower taxes also have unforeseen consequences. That is, higher revenues, the well-off paying a higher share rather than a lower share of their income, and low-income individuals rising with their income, getting better jobs, and paying a lower share of taxes. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Diana. I wish we could clone you and put you in the House of Representatives and the Senate so that French could have some well-informed allies.
He knows where to get in touch, and he can call me at the Heritage Foundation. I'm glad to help him out.
So our third speaker is Jim Lucier. He's managing partner at Capital Alpha Partners. He's a noted expert on taxation. And Jim, tell us about much misunderstood tax, capital gains, which even today some people confuse with normal income. But in the early 1920s, because of the way the original tax bill, income tax bill was written, there was a real question. Would it be taxed at 73%? capital gains?
Well, Steve, there certainly was. I just listened to this discussion and I hear names like Cactus Jack. Don't you wish we had members of Congress with names like Cactus Jack today? And we just heard about
by
this
the way,
epic-
John Nance Garner, by the way, was unhappy as vice president, and he said the vice presidency was not worth a pitcher of spit. The word spit was used for families. He had another word for it. But
He
anyway.
did indeed. Those were the days. But we've been talking about an epic battle between Andrew Mellon and Cactus Jack Garner to bring taxes down, and it took 5 years to bring the income tax down from 73 to 25%. But it took really about 5 months, technically 8 months, to bring the capital gains tax rate down from 73 to 12.5%. And how that happened is a really, really interesting story that is very, very close to where we're sitting here. It involves the U.S. Supreme Court, and I'll get to that in a moment. I did come prepared to do a book commercial. This is my own copy of Taxation, the People's Business by Andrew Mellon. It is available on Amazon for $1.99, but it's free on Kindle, which is a great buy because it's a beautifully written little book. It's the Strunk and White of taxation. I'm going to start out with an idea here. I want to preview the importance of the Supreme Court by saying that tax policy is a war between the economists and the lawyers. Just think about that for a minute. It's a war between economists and lawyers. And so what do I mean? I think that if you ask an economist to describe the best tax policy, the optimal tax policy, the economist is going to talk in scientific terms. He's going to say that all income in the economy is either income to capital or income to labor. And the most efficient tax system is going to be one that taxes all income at the source one time only with a low marginal rate that is neutral, that is the same for everyone and for all transactions. So that tax doesn't favor one person or one legal entity or one industry. It's neutral with respect to everybody. It's also a tax that is transparent, that is easy to administer and understand. And so it eliminates complexity, it eliminates distortion, it eliminates confusion. So if you pick a low marginal rate like 19% and you add a generous consumption allowance for labor income, you have that famous flat tax that our friend and panel chairman Steve Forbes made the basis of his presidential campaigns in 96 and 2000. Let's turn to Andrew Mellon for a moment. We know that Mellon at heart was an economist. He was a banker. He was a very successful businessman. Did you know, you've probably heard already several times, that he was the first venture capitalist in the United States. And he had a way of making great visionary investments. Right now, we are sitting across the street from a beautiful building that we'll go back to this evening, the Thomas Jefferson building of the Library of Congress. But at the very same time that the Thomas Jefferson building was being built, Andrew Mellon was paying out of his own pocket to build the fantastic building we now know as the U.S. National Gallery of Art. What's more, he donated his own collection of paintings to create the basis of an even bigger collection. He knew that if it wasn't the Mellon Gallery, if it was the National Gallery, that if he built it 10 times larger than it needed to be for his own paintings, supply would show up. People would donate the art, and they did. I mean, that shows the way the man was such a forward-thinking visionary. And of course, that art museum is a great gift to the American people, but I would argue that a more important gift was Mellon's gift of prosperity. So as an economist, Mellon served as Treasury Secretary to both President Harding and Calvin Coolidge. You've heard that many times already. He literally did espouse a scientific theory of taxation in his book. That book says that the problem of government is to fix tax rates which will bring in a maximum amount of revenue to the Treasury, and at the same time not bear too heavily on the taxpayer or on business enterprises. We've heard that before. He also talked about the importance of simplicity, clarity, something that people could understand, and something that was actually easier to follow than it was to flout. In other words, a very effective enforceable tax is what he was all about. And it's really hard to believe that this book, this very concisely clear little book, practically tax haikus, is based on the letters of advice that Mellon wrote to the Congressional Tax Committee. So I bet, Mr. Hill, that you don't get a lot of good letters like that from the White House anymore. What they get is a big, thick book called the Green Book that's like a phone book and not read by anyone precisely because it is so thick and it is so unreadable. But I would say that every single word in that Mellon book really predicts and is totally consistent with that flat tax vision that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you get away from first principles, get away from fundamental economics and mathematics, you could think about the lawyer's approach to taxes. And if I'm a lawyer, then anything that I describe in words can become a tax. How many windows on your house? I'll tax them. I'll count them. I'll tax them. If I have a new legal definition of taxation, hey, capital gains tax, wealth tax, whatever, I'll just write a law that taxes this new legal definition of wealth without really looking at the fundamental economics. So it's not surprising that every time someone comes up with a new legal definition of income, you can have a new tax, a new layer of tax, a duplicative tax, maybe more tax loopholes. The legal approach to taxation is ultimately a mess. And of course, once you have one group of lawyers write a tax law, you need another group of tax lawyers to figure it out, and the cycle goes on. The confusion just gets worse and worse over time. And that level of confusion is something I'm going to come to in a moment, too. But let's go back to Mellon. Let's go back to his career as Treasury Secretary. And you've heard, again, already that the 20s were a time of innovation, turbulence, and crisis. So many big new things that are important to us today were going on then. The U.S. had just experienced its first European war, first land war anywhere, in fact, outside the North American continent. As Bill Beach noticed, we had just experienced the global pandemic of the Spanish influenza. With the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, the U.S. just instituted, probably for the first time, unfortunately, a permanent income tax. Because of the war, federal taxation as a share of GDP had tripled from about 2% to 6%. So, we've heard a lot about even the debt ceiling dates to this time because the debt was so large and so unprecedented. And as you've also heard, the top marginal tax rate had increased from 7% in 16 to 77% as of 1918. And of course, the U.S. economy after the war went into a steep recession. The Woodrow Wilson administration had no doubt why this recession had occurred. I could read you the quotations, but in the interest of time, you can take my word for it that Woodrow Wilson himself wrote in his 1919 State of the Union address that there can be a point in peacetime when taxes are just too high and are economically counterproductive. His Treasury secretaries, both of them, William McAdoo and Carter Glass, said pretty much the same thing in their speeches in a presidential campaign and their letters to Congress. And of course, Mellon pointed out at the time that the 77% rate then was the highest tax rate in the history of the world. So people realized there was a problem. But, and there was also, I think, the beginnings of bipartisan agreement to start cutting those tax rates to something that was going to be more sustainable. But it's still hard. It's always hard to cut taxes. And so when the Wilson administration made their first crack, they took it down from 77 to 73. Not a big change here, not very radical. So economic crisis continues. The stock market was cut in half. We had massive wartime inflation followed by some of the biggest deflation ever, 18% one year. Unemployment was 16%. Soldiers coming back from the war could not find work. The farm economy was in a shambles. And then there were real social consequences. We had a question about culture wars. Well, the 1920s were a time of tremendous ferment and upset. It wasn't just dance competitions. There were bonus marchers. Across the country, we had strikes, we had protests, we had anarchist bombings, huge strike in Seattle, and really ugly incidents of mob violence, racial mob violence in the 1920s. So it was a time of crisis all around, and it was clearly time to do something to get that economy back in gear because every aspect of the United States, every aspect of U.S. society was really hurting badly due to the collapse of the economy. So let's get to the tax point here. You've heard how we had this long battle between Mellon and Cactus Jack. Congressman John Nance Garner, a man who went on to become Vice President of the United States, a man who went on to become Speaker of the House, a very distinguished fellow. So what was going on here, and why did it take so long to cut the income tax rate when they cut the capital gains tax rate from 73 as of the beginning of 1921 down to 12 and a half? Think about that, 73 to 12 and a half, a huge jump and almost immediately. So where did 12 and a half come from? Mellon, his longtime goal was always a 25% tax. His capital gains tax proposal had a 2-year holding period. So, divide 25 by 2 and you can get 12.5% that way. I haven't seen a quotation. I went through his book looking for a justification for the 12.5% rate, but still it's pretty stunning. So the real question then, what did Congress do? Why did Congress suddenly turn on a dime and cut the capital gains tax rate so quickly? And there we have the Supreme Court coming to the rescue, if you will. The Supreme Court considered not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 cases involving the capital gains tax in early 1921. And that's because people really had no idea what counted as a capital gain. Is it your house? Is it a car, as Amity said, or excuse me, as Diana said, is it a painting? How do you deal with capital losses? Should you treat the sale of appreciated securities the same way that you would treat cans of soup in a dry goods store? Nobody really know. And as a result of this extremely high capital gains tax that had no clarity, no guidance, no general understanding of what a taxable capital gain would be, there was the capital strike, as Julius Bache said. Bache founded Prudential Securities, which was my old company before I founded my own. There was that market strike. There was a huge industry of tax avoidance, let's face it, tax evasion, misallocation of capital, taking people's productive investments from the capital markets and moving them all into muni bonds. So I mentioned earlier that the equity markets had collapsed, and to have this misallocation of capital in the bond market made things even worse. So it was critical and it was a crisis, and no one knew what to do. The Supreme Court's ruling in a case called Merchant Loan and Trust versus Smetanka, and 3 other cases. These 4 cases each dealt with a particular asset class, but the Supreme Court basically said, this is the law of the land. There is a capital gains tax. It is 73%, and you figure it out because we won't. The law is the law, and you're going to pay this tax. And the minute the Supreme Court did that and said that there is no escape, you need to figure this out now, that there is really no valid interpretation of a practical way to administer this law. Interestingly, the Supreme Court dismissed as ingenious various taxpayer arguments, saying that the rate should not, in fact, be so high, or we should get a deduction for basis. The Supreme Court just said, no, 73% of everything. That happened on March 30th, 1921. And so by November 30th, President Coolidge was signing the tax reform bill, the Revenue Act of 1921. And it went through Congress at record speed. It only reduced the top marginal rate to 58%. As Steve said, we went through other iterations, bringing the top rate further down, but including that invasion of privacy known as the Peeping Tom provision. But the fact is that once the Supreme Court made capital gains tax something that you couldn't sweep under the rug, Congress did move. It moved really fast, and it cut the rate from 73 to 12% in a matter of months. So with that, I'll turn it back to Steve.
Thank you. We'll give a couple of questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience, to the young people who seem to have a real knack of asking good questions quickly, unlike adults who seem to want to make speeches before they get to the question. So we're going to favor you. Congressman, can you quickly hit the importance of tax rate cuts versus other kinds of cuts? Like some of members of the GOP for a while were infatuated with child credits to show their sympathy for the middle class and all that kind of stuff. How do you make the case that you got to cut the rates, not just have a tax cut giving money back, but how it affects the economy?
Well, it gets back to simplicity, first and foremost, and fair treatment across the entire economy. So when you do a tax credit format, I mean, you're essentially picking winners and losers. You're having sort of an industrial policy approach to, or, a social policy approach to the tax code, when the most clear and concise way to do it is do it at the marginal rate level and make it apply across the board. So, but that doesn't stop people from looking at this, and you see that in the code. You see it in housing. You see it in child care. And that goes back to Coolidge's time when people started. We had a marital deduction in the original tax code where married people could file jointly. So the tax code has always had that spin to it, I would say, Steve. But the clarity of simplicity is why I think dealing with rates is better than cluttering it with a lot of special features.
I think people, when they come to April 15th, will sympathize with simplicity. Quickly, Congressman, give us an overview of the politics of getting a tax cut through. We saw what a slog it was even when you had good majorities in Congress in the 20s. How do you size it up today, both today, which this administration won't do, but maybe the House can do something to set the foundation for 2025, and then after 2025, can we get good, persistent tax cuts?
Well, during the 4 years of the Trump administration, we were able to do two things. One, we were able to move a real estate towards simplicity by simplifying the filing, increasing that standard deduction. Really, 9 out of 10 Arkansans could just pay on the form easy. They were not having to fill the form out at all. And that was huge. That was almost double for our families in Arkansas by simplifying the tax code. Every person at every income level received a benefit from the tax cuts under the Trump administration. And secondly, something that was a Bill Bradley idea from the 80s, which was to end the double taxation of American income earned abroad.
Dollar bill.
Was solved finally. And we allowed people to repatriate then almost $1 trillion back to the United States for investing. So we simplified the corporate tax rate down to the low 20s. We removed the double taxation of earnings abroad, which is a huge issue for America's multinational businesses, brought that capital home, and we simplified things for our families. Now, some of those provisions expire in 2025. And so that's why I support making those Trump tax cuts permanent. I think that's the way to go. And I would conclude on this. We are at a 77-year high in what? Revenue as a percentage of GDP. We have never brought in more revenue to the United States than we have in the last years following those tax cut reforms by President Trump. We don't have a revenue problem in this country. We have a spending problem.
Diana, you've been in the center of not just understanding economics, but also the sausage-making process of getting things done inside an administration. You've seen it firsthand. With the entitlements being in crisis, huge deficits, can we get tax cuts? We always know the spenders say, well, we can't afford it, even though reducing the tax rates, as we know, would mean more revenue, but they always use, oh, we can't afford tax cuts. Based on your political experience, can we get the tax cuts in the face of these massive deficits and Medicare and Social Security about to go bust with their trust funds?
Well, it's very difficult to cut any programs. That's why the best thing to do when you set up a program is to have an automatic sunset for it. So then you have to re-up it after a particular number of years. Once you have a program, then there's entrenched interests. That's why it's so interesting that the pandemic emergency has not been lifted, because there were a number of programs that were put in place, broadened eligibility for food stamps, broadened eligibility for Medicaid, that have not vanished because the pandemic emergency has not been taken off. And this gives the president the ability to keep these programs going. Congress has kept them going. There's been a pause on student debt payments, for example, even though the unemployment rate is at 3.4%, the lowest since 1969. There are 11 million unfilled jobs. The labor market is very strong. Anyone who wants a job now practically can get one. I think we have learned from Coolidge that tax cuts bring more revenue. We are now, as Congressman Hill said, benefiting from President Trump's tax cuts. That's one reason that we have not gone into a recession last year or this year. And we need to keep these taxes low rather than increasing them.
Jim, before we go to the audience, we live in a fantasy world. Capital gains, should they be taxed at all?
Well, that goes back to my earlier point about economists versus lawyers. When lawyers can describe a new concept, they write a new law, and so they have double taxation. The point is that capital gains are the capital value of future earnings, and if you tax those earnings at the time of earning, you really do it much more efficiently if you tax income at the source one time only. Now, this actually, believe it or not, may be an area where Europe is far ahead of the U.S. in terms of tax policy, because Europe does raise a lot of tax revenue, but they raise it with the consumption-based taxes. The United States requires or relies much more on income taxes, including the capital gains tax. So, we raise taxes, we raise revenue in the United States using some of the most inefficient and counterproductive taxes. But the reality is that an optimal rate of taxation, even an optimal corporate rate, is zero. And I think that is, very clear, and it's supported by the economic evidence.
If I could say a point of view against the value-added taxes that have permeated the rest of the world, these are money machines that you put in place at a very low tax rate, and then you crank them up. So the Europeans have value-added taxes of over 20%, and they don't even see those because it's basically in the price of the good. At the same time, they have very high income taxes. They also have higher Social Security taxes than we do, which is one reason that Europe is growing more slowly than the United States.
And I think that was best summarized by Paul McCartney and John Lennon when they lived the 70s and wrote, "I'll tax the street. If you try to sit, I'll tax your seat. If you get too cold, I'll tax the heat. If you take a walk, I'll tax your feet. I'm the tax man."
That's right. In fact, one of the greatest newspaper stories that I wish I had clipped the time was quoting Mick Jagger on taxation and why he was a tax exile from the UK. And he said, "Hey, I'd pay 50%. 50% is fair, but no more." So, Mick Jagger himself is a good example.
Well, if those are the sources, why don't we go to the audience? Put people in the right mood. Raise your hand, and they'll bring the microphone over. So why don't we start here, and then we'll work across the room. State your name.
My name is Sam Bourne from New Hampshire, and the panel today talked a lot about cutting taxes. And I know from Coolidge's time they cut it from 73% to 25%, but with respect to the Loeffler curve, what is the ideal rate of taxation? Because presumably if taxes continue to be cut, as they did with Coolidge, it increased income, but when do we hit the point when taxes will continue to decrease income and is no longer incentive to continue to cut taxes?
Zero. But
Yeah.
no. But seriously, it looks like with world experience that if you get it below 20, you get maximum impact. And Coolidge, I think, if he had been president for another term, he and Mellon would have gone for cutting the 25 down to perhaps 20 or even a tad lower.
I would just add that, in Coolidge's Andrew Mellon's book, The Taxation, the People's Business, which I think was ghostwritten by Parker Gilbert. But Gilbert, that's what they were talking about when they said scientific taxation. This was the whole mission. They were cranking data by hand, no computers then, to try to establish what they thought that marginal rate would be, where you maximize what Art Laffer made famous during the Reagan administration.
There's also a matter of whether revenue constrains spending. Because with lower revenue, you find that perhaps spending on roads can be built with private sector funds rather than federal funds. One problem we have now is that the revenue we have is not constraining spending. Spending, as Congressman Hill knows, is just through the roof. And if spending is through the roof, then there's upward pressure on these ideal tax rates that we might try to put in place. We need to have a system the way states do, where they cannot spend more than the revenue they get in.
Hi, my name's Nick Jacobson. I'm from Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm curious, Pennsylvania, we just had a big lawsuit about apparently our schools are funded by property taxes, and that is unconstitutional because it is inequitable. But it made me think about the relationship between local taxes, state taxes, and federal taxes. I know that the Trump tax cuts eliminated some tax deductions for state taxes paid. So I'm curious how you all think about whether there should be more synchronous work between local, state, federal taxation, or whether each of these levels of government should be making decisions independently of one another about ideal taxation rates.
And I know Diana will have opinions on this, but I'll just start out and say that was one of the key debates in those tax reform debates in 2017 and 2018, and this is the state and local tax deduction. This is your state income tax and your state property taxes. And the idea was, why do all the citizens of the country, across the country writ at large, the general welfare, subsidize exceedingly high tax rates in some states? So they looked at property taxes and state income taxes, across the whole country, and we picked $10,000 as the cap of the top that would maintain a deduction. And so some of the blue states have much higher rates, and that was the compromise. And so New York, Illinois, Connecticut, California crying the blues there. But why should all of us across the whole nation subsidize poor budget performance in a few states?
No, I'll pass, thanks.
Next question here.
Hi, I'm Alex Pavalsky from New York City. You talked a lot about domestic taxes, but one form of taxation that I find really problematic is tariffs. And both the former president and the current president talk a lot about increasing American manufacturing, buy American, hire American, and increasing tariffs, withdrawing from the TPP, as we saw. What would Coolidge do about decreasing tariffs and making imported goods more affordable for the American people?
Well, Coolidge was a protectionist. That was the ethos of the Republican Party at the time, Mellon as well. But as we learned from income taxes, tariffs are a tax, and you can have benign rates and you can have malignant rates. And unfortunately, in my mind, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which began making its way through Congress in 1929, helped precipitate the stock market crash, blowing up the global trading system, massively increasing taxes, like putting in an income tax of 85%, and the results were bad. I'm opposed to tariffs. I think there are other ways to achieve good things, but that's why I'm here and not in my presidential library. So I'm sure.
Well, we need to be thinking about it in terms of what is our national interest. So I don't believe it's in our national interest to have taxes on lumber from Canada, for example. Canada is our trading partner, our friend. We should have approved the Keystone XL pipeline to allow more oil to come in so it can be refined in our refineries. On the other hand, if other countries put up barriers towards our goods, then we should consider tariffs against their goods. We need reciprocity. We can't just say we are going to be free of tariffs, but allow other countries to have barriers to our exports so that our small businesses and our farmers are hurt from other countries' policies without some kind of reciprocal retaliation.
By the way, after World War II, for a number of decades, systematically countries got together and did reciprocal reductions of trade barriers, and very, very helpful to global trade. Why don't this young woman here?
Hi, my name is Audrey Camina from San Francisco, California, and this is for Congressman French Hill. Mr. Forbes mentioned your extensive study of Nicholas Longworth, and I was wondering how you expect he would have navigated the rampant high spending and deficit spending that you face in the House today.
Well, Longworth, his wife, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, said was an expert compromiser. It was Longworth who took those progressive insurgents into the office and convinced them to vote for Fred Gillette, and that they would be listened to in the new Congress. So he was responsible for getting Gillette that speakership after 9 ballots, in my view. And so Longworth was a good tactician. He was a good listener, and I think he would have followed with the majority. He was a very practical guy. He told Coolidge and Mellon in 22, I don't have the votes. I'll do the best I can, and that's why President Coolidge signed the 24 Act, as Steve Ford said, and President Reagan was great at this. If I can get 80% of what I want, I'm going to come get it. I'll come back for the other 20. And that was precisely what Coolidge did. He campaigned on it, ran a national campaign on it to get the rest of what he wanted after the 24 election. And so he was, if he had the votes, he was going to work to his advantage. If he didn't have the vote, he would get as much as he could. So I think he would have set a goal and navigated it, and his friend Jack Garner would have been right there at his side.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We don't want to take time from your upcoming free lunch. So want to thank our panel and thank all of you.
Thank you all very much.